Right now, a fragile ceasefire is holding in Gaza, but a ceasefire is not peace. Palestinians are living behind a shifting military boundary, known as the Yellow Line. Hamas refuses to disarm. Israel refuses to fully withdraw. Once again, the conflict has reached a familiar deadlock. But today's crisis didn't begin in 2023 or even in 1948. To understand why this conflict keeps repeating itself, we have to go back more than 100 years to a small piece of land claimed by two different peoples. Our story begins in the late 19th century. At the time, the land known as Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. It had been home to a diverse population. Most people were Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians. There were also long-established Jewish communities, living in cities such as Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. Meanwhile, across Europe, many Jewish communities faced growing discrimination. Anti-Semitism was becoming more widespread. Violence and persecution were forcing many to question whether they could ever truly be safe. Out of that reality, a political movement emerged. It became known as Zionism. Its goal was to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. Beginning in the late 1800s, Jewish immigrants started arriving in Palestine in growing numbers. Some came for religious reasons. Many came seeking safety and the chance to build a new future. Then, the First World War changed everything. In 1917, the British government issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But there was an important complication. The land was still home to a large Arab population, and those communities had not been consulted before the declaration was made. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the war, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. Two national movements were now looking toward the same land, and over the decades that followed, that collision would become increasingly difficult to avoid. As the British mandate continued, the population of Palestine was changing. Jewish immigration increased, especially during the 1930s, as more Jews fled persecution in Europe. After the Holocaust, even more survivors looked to Palestine as the only place where they could build a new life. For the Arab population, these changes brought growing uncertainty. Many feared they would eventually lose political control over the land they called home. Tensions continued to rise. Violence became more frequent. Both Jewish and Arab armed groups carried out attacks, and Britain found itself unable to satisfy either side. By the end of the Second World War, the British government decided to hand the question of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations proposed dividing the territory into two independent states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem would be placed under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the proposal despite the difficult compromises it required. Many Arab leaders, along with the surrounding Arab states, rejected the plan. They argued that it unfairly divided the land without the consent of the Arab majority living there. The United Nations approved the Partition Plan, but instead of resolving the conflict, it marked the beginning of an even larger confrontation. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the establishment of the State of Israel. For many Jews, it marked the realization of a long-held national aspiration. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon entered the former British mandate. The first Arab-Israeli war had begun. Against considerable odds, the new Israeli state survived. By the time the fighting ended in 1949, Israel controlled more territory than it had been allocated under the United Nations Partition Plan. Jordan took control of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Egypt assumed control of the Gaza Strip, but the greatest human impact was felt by the civilian population. Around 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes during the war. Many believed they would return once the fighting was over. Most never did. For Israelis, this conflict became known as the War of Independence. For Palestinians, it became known as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. More than 75 years later, those two names still reflect two very different memories of the same war, and those competing memories continue to shape the conflict to this day. By 1967, the conflict had entered a new phase. Relations between Israel and its neighbouring Arab states had deteriorated once again. In June, after weeks of rising tensions, that war broke out. It would last around just 6 days, but its consequences would shape the Middle East for generations. Israel captured the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula also from Egypt. For Israel, the war dramatically improved its military position. For Palestinians, but it meant that Gaza and the West Bank now came under Israeli military occupation. This is where the term the occupied territories comes from. After the war, the United Nations adopted Resolution 242. It called for Israel's withdrawal from territories captured during the conflict in exchange for peace and secure, recognized borders for every state in the region. The resolution became the foundation for decades of diplomacy, but its key questions, how much land should be returned and what lasting peace would actually look like, remained unanswered. And those same questions just continue to shape negotiations to this day. By the early 1990s, after decades of conflict, there were signs that peace might finally be possible. In 1993, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization signed what became known as the Oslo Accords. For the first time, the two sides formally recognized one another. The agreement established the Palestinian Authority and set out a roadmap toward a negotiated two-state solution. Around the world, the images of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn became a symbol of hope. But the optimism did not last. Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to expand. Palestinian militant groups carried out deadly attacks. Trust between the two sides began to erode. Then, in 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process. The momentum created by Oslo was never fully regained. 5 years later, following the collapse of further negotiations, the Second Intifada erupted. Years of violence followed. By the beginning of the new century, the hope that Oslo had inspired had largely given way to deep mistrust, and the vision of two states appeared more distant than ever. In 2005, Israel made a dramatic decision. It withdrew all of its settlers and its permanent military presence from the Gaza Strip. Many hoped this could become the first step toward a lasting peace. But events took a different course. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. The following year, after violent clashes with its rival, Fatah, Hamas took full control of Gaza. The Palestinian territories were now politically divided. Hamas governed Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority continued to administer parts of the West Bank. In response, Israel, together with Egypt, imposed a blockade on Gaza. Citing security concerns following Hamas's takeover, over the years that followed, the region was repeatedly drawn into war. Major conflicts erupted in 2008, 2012, 2014, and again in 2021. Each war ended with another ceasefire, but none resolved the deeper political conflict. Instead, the cycle kept repeating: war, ceasefire, rearmament, and then another war. By 2023, the divide between Gaza and Israel had become one of the most volatile flashpoints anywhere in the world. Then, on October 7th, 2023, the conflict changed dramatically. Thousands of Hamas-led militants crossed into southern Israel. Around 1,200 people were killed. Hundreds more were taken hostage and brought into Gaza. It was the deadliest attack in Israel's history. Israel responded with a large-scale military campaign aimed at destroying Hamas and securing the release of the hostages. The war that followed would become the deadliest in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By the time a ceasefire was reached, vast areas of Gaza had been devastated. Most of the population had been displaced at least once. The reported death toll had risen into the tens of thousands. The humanitarian consequences were immense, and once again the conflict left both Israelis and Palestinians carrying profound loss. The ceasefire stopped much of the fighting, but it did not end the conflict. Today, the large-scale fighting has largely paused, but peace has not returned. Israeli military operations continue in parts of Gaza. Many hostages remain unaccounted for. Hamas has not disarmed, and much of Gaza remains under Israeli military control or subject to military restrictions. Both sides continue to accuse each other of violating the ceasefire. For millions of civilians, daily life remains defined by uncertainty, and after more than a century of conflict, the central question remains exactly the same. How can two peoples with competing histories, competing identities, and competing national aspirations share the same land? For generations, that question has remained unanswered, and until it is, the conflict is unlikely to truly end. For more than a century, this conflict has been shaped often by competing national movements, war, displacement, fear, and generations of unresolved claims. Its history cannot be reduced to a single event or a single moment, and understanding it means understanding the people, the decisions, and the history that brought us here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to explore more of the history behind today's conflicts, consider subscribing, because understanding the past is the first step toward understanding the present.